What if I told you that the United States' long-standing dominance over the global fighter jet market may be facing its most serious challenge yet? Not from Russia, not from China, but from an unexpected partnership involving a British engine manufacturer, Sweden's fighter jet industry, and one of America's closest allies, Canada. What is quietly unfolding right now could reshape global defense politics in ways most people have not yet realized. And if you care about American influence, military leadership, and the economic power tied to the defense industry, then this story deserves your full attention. Because behind the scenes, something remarkable is happening. The mainstream media has barely touched it, yet the consequences for the United States could be enormous. By the time we reach the end of this story, you will understand why defense analysts and policymakers are watching this situation very closely and why it could mark the beginning of a much larger shift in global military power. To understand what is at stake, we need to start with the foundation of American dominance in military aviation. For decades, the United States has controlled the global fighter jet market, and it did not happen by accident. The centerpiece of that dominance is the F-35 Lightning II, developed by Lockheed Martin. This aircraft represents the pinnacle of modern military aviation. It is a fifth-generation stealth fighter equipped with advanced sensors, cutting-edge avionics, and powerful networking capabilities that allow pilots to see and understand the battlefield in ways earlier aircraft simply could not. Around the world, countries line up to buy the F-35. But when nations purchase it, they are not just buying an airplane. They are joining an entire system controlled largely by the United States. Software updates, spare parts, mission systems, and upgrades all move through American channels. The Pentagon maintains oversight, ensuring that every aircraft remains connected to an American-managed ecosystem. And that arrangement has always provided Washington with a powerful advantage. If a country operates F-35s, it remains closely tied to the United States for maintenance, upgrades, and operational integration. In other words, the aircraft itself becomes a strategic tool of influence. For years, most allied nations accepted this structure, recognizing the benefits of access to the world's most advanced fighter technology. But now that assumption is beginning to crack. Because the country questioning this arrangement is not an adversary, it is Canada, a NATO ally, a neighbor with the longest undefended border in the world with the United States. For generations, the two countries have worked side by side through alliances like North Atlantic Treaty Organization and North American Aerospace Defense Command. They have fought in the same wars, coordinated their defense strategies, and shared responsibility for protecting North American airspace. Yet today, Ottawa is openly reconsidering whether relying entirely on the American-built F-35 is still the best choice for its future Air Force. And the reason is not simply about aircraft performance. It is about sovereignty, independence, and the growing question of whether putting all of your national defense capabilities under the control of another country, even a close ally, is a risk worth taking. That realization is where this story truly begins to accelerate, because once Canada started asking that question, it opened the door to a completely different possibility, and that possibility could change the balance of power in the global fighter jet market in ways few people expected. That possibility arrived in the form of a fighter jet built far from Washington, an aircraft designed with a very different philosophy. The moment Canada began questioning its complete dependence on American systems, another option suddenly returned to the conversation. The Gripen fighter developed by Saab AB in Sweden. Now let's be clear about something important. On paper, the Gripen is not the same class of aircraft as the F-35. The American jet remains a fifth-generation stealth platform with some of the most advanced sensor integration ever created. In a direct high-end combat scenario against a sophisticated adversary, the F-35 still holds a technological advantage. No serious defense analyst disputes that. But the Gripen brings something very different to the table, something that many countries are beginning to value just as much as raw technology: independence. Sweden designed the Gripen during the Cold War with a very specific strategic philosophy in mind. Sweden expected that in a major conflict, its air bases could be destroyed quickly. So the aircraft had to be able to operate almost anywhere. It had to launch from highways, land on short improvised runways, and be serviced by small crews in remote locations. Within minutes, it could be refueled, rearmed, and sent back into the air. That flexibility created a fighter jet that is incredibly efficient to operate. While the F-35 can cost anywhere between $35,000 and nearly $50,000 per flight hour, the Gripen's operating cost is estimated to be around $8,000 per hour. Over the lifespan of an Air Force fleet, that difference becomes enormous. Governments calculating defense budgets cannot ignore numbers like that. But cost and flexibility are only part of the appeal. The real attraction for countries like Canada is that the Gripen was built to be controlled entirely by the nation operating it. Software systems, mission data, upgrades, and maintenance are not locked inside a foreign government's approval structure. For any country worried about sovereignty, that is a powerful advantage. Yet for years, there was one major obstacle preventing the Gripen from becoming a true alternative to American aircraft, and that obstacle sat inside the jet itself, its engine. The newest version of the aircraft, the Gripen E, currently uses the F414 engine, produced by General Electric in the United States. That means the aircraft falls under American export regulations known as ITAR, or International Traffic in Arms Regulations. These rules give the United States government significant control over how American defense technology is sold and used. In practical terms, that meant any country purchasing the Gripen would still require Washington's approval because the aircraft contained a critical American component. Even if Canada chose the Gripen to escape reliance on U.S. systems, the United States would still hold influence through the engine. For years, this created a strategic dead end. Nations seeking independence from American defense controls had no real alternative if they wanted a modern Western fighter jet. And that is exactly where the story takes an unexpected turn, because a new proposal from Rolls-Royce Holdings may have just opened a path that could remove American control from the aircraft entirely. If that plan succeeds, the Gripen would no longer rely on an American engine. The United States would lose its regulatory leverage over the aircraft. And suddenly, a fighter jet, once constrained by American technology, could become the first fully independent NATO-compatible alternative to the F-35. And that is where the situation begins to escalate in ways Washington may not have anticipated. The proposal that could change everything centers on a new engine concept known as the EJ230, developed by Rolls-Royce Holdings. The design is based on the EJ200 engine that has already powered the Eurofighter Typhoon for years. This is not an experimental concept or an untested idea sitting in a laboratory. The underlying technology has already proven itself in real combat aircraft across multiple European air forces. In other words, the foundation already exists. Adapting that technology for the Gripen would allow the aircraft to replace the American F414 engine entirely. And if that happens, something remarkable occurs. The jet would immediately fall outside American export control regulations. No ITAR restrictions. No American veto over exports. No requirement for Pentagon approval. For countries seeking greater strategic autonomy, that possibility is extremely attractive. What makes this development even more significant is geography. Rolls-Royce Holdings already operates major facilities in Montreal. That means engine production or assembly could potentially take place directly in Canada. Suddenly, the project stops looking like a simple aircraft purchase and starts looking like something much bigger, a national aerospace industry opportunity. And Canada appears to be paying very close attention. The shift became visible in 2025 when Canada's government, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, launched a formal review of the country's planned F-35 purchase. The original deal had been announced in 2022 and involved acquiring 88 aircraft to replace Canada's aging CF-18 fleet. The total cost was expected to reach roughly $14 billion. At the time, the decision seemed final. But geopolitical tensions began to complicate that assumption. Trade disputes between the United States and Canada escalated. Tariffs appeared. Political rhetoric grew sharper. Suddenly, Canadian policymakers started asking a difficult question. If Washington could pressure Canada economically, what would prevent similar pressure from being applied through military systems? Those concerns gained momentum when Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered remarks at the World Economic Forum in Davos in early 2026. In his speech, he emphasized the importance of diversification and resilience among allied nations. It was diplomatic language, but the meaning was widely understood. Canada did not want to rely entirely on a single partner for its defense technology. Soon afterward, reports began emerging in Canadian media suggesting Ottawa might reconsider the full F-35 order. Instead of purchasing all 88 jets, Canada could potentially acquire a smaller number of F-35s, while adding the Gripen as a second aircraft type in a mixed fleet. That idea alone sent shockwaves through defense circles. Because if one of America's closest allies begins splitting its fighter fleet between U.S. aircraft and an independent European alternative, it sends a message to every other country watching the global arms market. And that message is simple. Reliance on American systems is no longer the only option. For companies like Saab AB, the opportunity is enormous. The Swedish manufacturer quickly moved to strengthen its proposal, announcing plans that could bring large-scale aerospace manufacturing to Canada itself. Production of the Gripen fighter and the Global Eye surveillance aircraft could create thousands of jobs and establish a major industrial partnership. But for Washington, the implications reach far beyond a single contract. Because if Canada proves that a modern NATO-compatible fighter jet can be built and operated without American oversight, other countries around the world may start asking the same question Canada is asking right now. And that is where this story begins to expand, far beyond Ottawa. That matters because this is no longer just a Canadian procurement story. It is quickly turning into a test case for the future of defense independence across the Western world. If Canada shows that it can field a capable, modern, NATO-compatible fighter force without placing itself fully under American industrial and political control, other nations will notice immediately. And once that door opens, it will not be easy to close. From Canada's point of view, the attraction is not hard to understand. Saab is not simply offering an aircraft. It is offering industrial participation on a scale that speaks directly to Canadian political priorities. The company has said that local production of the Gripen and the Global Eye surveillance platform in Canada could support as many as 12,600 jobs. That is not a small side benefit. That is a national economic argument. It means factories, engineers, skilled workers, supply chains, and long-term industrial capacity rooted inside Canada rather than outside it. That promise hits even deeper because Canada still carries the memory of the Avro Arrow, the advanced domestic fighter program that was cancelled in 1959. For many Canadians, that decision remains a symbol of lost industrial ambition and excessive dependence on the United States. So when Saab talks about building aircraft on Canadian soil with Canadian labor and Canadian materials, it is not just making an economic pitch. It is touching a nerve that has existed for decades. From Washington's perspective, however, this is where the alarm bells really begin to ring. The United States ambassador to Canada has already warned publicly that if Canada pulls back from the F-35, there could be implications for continental defense cooperation under NORAD. That statement was not subtle. It was a reminder that fighter jet purchases are not isolated business deals. They shape how allies train together, share data, maintain readiness, and coordinate missions across shared airspace. And to be fair, that concern is real. A mixed fleet creates serious complications. Two aircraft types mean two maintenance systems, two training pipelines, separate logistics chains, different planning requirements, and more operational complexity. Running both F-35S and Gripen side by side would be more complicated than simply standardizing around a single platform. Military planners know that. Canadian officials know that. Washington certainly knows that. But what the United States may be underestimating is this. Canada may now be willing to accept those complications if the trade-off is greater sovereignty. That is the heart of the issue. This is no longer just a question of what aircraft performs best in a technical comparison. It is a question of whether Ottawa believes full dependence on the United States still serves Canada's long-term national interests. And in the current political climate, that answer appears less certain than it did even a few years ago. The financial contrast only sharpens that debate. Canada's F-35 plan was valued at roughly $14 billion for 88 aircraft. Meanwhile, the Gripen proposal has been paired with lower operating costs, promises of domestic assembly, and thousands of Canadian jobs. That combination carries real weight in a democracy where voters care not only about security, but also about employment, industrial development, and national control. And once you look beyond Canada, the implications become even bigger, because if this engine swap goes forward and the Gripen becomes a truly independent Western fighter option, every middle power in the world will suddenly have a new model to consider, and that could begin to chip away at American influence contract by contract. Every lost F-35 sale would mean more than a missed business opportunity for Lockheed Martin. It would represent a gradual weakening of one of the most effective tools of American geopolitical influence. The F-35 program is not just a fighter jet project. It is one of the largest industrial and strategic systems ever created. Its supply chain reaches across the United States, supporting factories, engineers, contractors, and workers in community after community. When allied nations buy into that program, they are not only purchasing aircraft. They are tying themselves economically, politically, and militarily to the United States for decades. That is why this moment matters so much. Still, it is important to keep the analysis honest. The Gripen is not a full substitute for the F-35 inches every mission. Stealth matters. In a high-end conflict against a major adversary like China or Russia, the ability to penetrate defended airspace without being detected is not optional. It is essential. The F-35 was built for that environment. Its sensor fusion, data sharing capability, and ability to present the pilot with a single integrated picture of the battlefield remain major advantages. The Gripen, no matter how efficient or independent it may be, does not fully match that capability. That is why some analysts believe the most realistic answer for Canada may be a mixed fleet. In that model, Canada would keep a smaller number of F-35s for missions requiring maximum interoperability with the United States and high-end combat capability, while using Gripens for everyday patrols, NATO deployments, and Arctic sovereignty operations. It is not a clean solution, but it may be the one that best balances capability, cost, and independence. And in many ways, that messy middle ground tells us the real story. The most important development here is not whether Canada buys only F-35s or splits the fleet. It is the fact that America's closest ally is even seriously exploring alternatives at all. That alone says something profound about the current state of trust inside the Western alliance. Because this is not only about aircraft, it is about confidence. It is about whether countries that have stood beside the United States for generations still believe that dependence on American systems is always safe, stable, and politically sustainable. Right now, that confidence appears to be weakening. The timeline makes that clear. In 2022, Canada selected the F-35 and announced plans for 88 aircraft. In 2023, the first 16 jets were locked in. In March 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government launched a formal review of the broader purchase. By late 2025, Saab was openly discussing Canadian assembly possibilities. In December 2025, it unveiled the jobs package. In January 2026, Carney spoke in Davos about diversification. Around the same time, reports suggested Canada was leaning toward a mixed fleet. Then in February 2026, news emerged that Ottawa was still making payments for long-lead F-35 components, signaling that it wanted to preserve flexibility while the review continued. So the direction is not final, but the trend is unmistakable. Canada is trying to create options. And while that debate continues, discussions around a Rolls-Royce powered Gripen have only gathered momentum in defense circles, industry forums, and government conversations in Ottawa, London, and Stockholm, which means this is no longer a hypothetical scenario. It is a live strategic question, and the next steps could determine whether Canada becomes the launch point for a new aerospace model outside American control. And if that happens, the ripple effects will not stop at Canada's borders. Because a Canadian Gripen production line would not exist only to supply the Royal Canadian Air Force. Once the infrastructure is in place, factories, supply chains, trained engineers, assembly lines, that capability could serve customers far beyond North America. Several countries are already watching closely. Ukraine has previously expressed interest in acquiring more than 100 Gripen fighters to rebuild its air force for the long term. Colombia has already moved forward with a contract for Gripen aircraft. Other nations in Southeast Asia, South America, and the Middle East are constantly evaluating their options for modern fighters that do not come with heavy political conditions attached. If Canada becomes a manufacturing hub, those aircraft could potentially be assembled there, exported worldwide, and powered by a non-American engine. Suddenly, the equation changes. Instead of a small European fighter program, you are looking at a new aerospace ecosystem capable of producing hundreds of aircraft over time. And every single one of those aircraft would represent something significant, a modern Western fighter jet operating completely outside American export control. That is why defense officials in Washington are watching the situation carefully. Behind closed doors, conversations between the United States and Canada have reportedly intensified. The public comments from the U.S. ambassador warning about implications for continental defense cooperation are only the visible portion of a much larger diplomatic effort, because the Pentagon understands exactly what is at stake here. If Canada partially walks away from the F-35 program, the signal to the rest of the world will be powerful. It will tell other countries that even America's closest ally is willing to diversify its military suppliers. That example could encourage others to follow the same path, especially nations that have long been uncomfortable with strict export restrictions or political conditions attached to U.S. weapons systems. But there is another dimension to this story that may matter even more. Around the world, a broader trend is already underway. The European Union has been discussing greater defense independence. South Korea and Japan are investing heavily in domestic fighter programs. India has been pursuing indigenous aircraft development for years because it wants strategic autonomy. Across the globe, nations are slowly trying to reduce dependence on any single defense supplier. The potential Rolls-Royce engine integration into the Gripen fits directly into that trend. In many ways, it is both a symptom of the shift and a catalyst that could accelerate it. So, what should we watch next? First, any official agreement between Saab AB and Rolls-Royce Holdings confirming development of the EJ 230 engine for the Gripen. That would signal that the project is moving from discussion to reality. Second, watch Canada's defense procurement announcements. If Ottawa formally reduces the number of F-35S or confirms a mixed fleet that includes the Gripen, it will mark a major turning point. Third, keep an eye on Washington's response. If the United States begins offering concessions on pricing, industrial participation, or technology access to keep Canada fully inside the F-35 program, it will show just how seriously the Pentagon views this challenge. And finally, watch the global market. If other countries begin lining up behind a Canadian-built Gripen program, the balance of power in the fighter jet industry could shift faster than many experts expected. Because in the end, this story is not just about aircraft. It is about trust, alliances, and the evolving balance between partnership and independence in the modern world. The question now is whether Canada will stay fully inside the American defense ecosystem or help create a new path that many other countries may choose to follow. If you found this breakdown useful, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Should Canada stay committed to the F-35 or pursue greater independence with the Gripen? Share this video with someone who follows global defense or geopolitics, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next update as this story continues to unfold.